Oh look, Pat Condell's done another lovely video, isn't that nice? Let's have a quick look and see what he's saying.
Well, I understand that some bed bugs have been found at the United Nations building in New York, which is unfortunate, but some good may come of it, you never know. Maybe somebody could find a place for them on the Human Rights Council. They might help to elevate the integrity of that forum somewhat.
WTF.
Yes, it's that time of year again when members of the cartel of third world dictatorships known as the Organization of Islamic Congress.
Great. Start off with some character assassination and then move on to something a little more thought-provoking.
Take time out from brutalizing their own people to
yeah, and then make your character assassination of them even worse.
Force through a resolution at the Human Rights Council against what they call the defamation of religions, by which they mean telling the truth about Islam and...
Well, you don't tell the truth about Islam, do you? There's much more to the subject than you personally, Mr. Pat Condell, could ever possibly understand. And you are just a xenophobic bigot. And that's what you spend your time being. You just sit there and spout all this drivel.
The countries where it calls the shots. They say they want to stop people wrongly associating their religion with terrorism and human rights violations. But
yeah, well, if you think it was only a group of 10 people called Revolution Muslims who created a lot of the more recent issues, then you'll see that much more than 99.9% recurring of the Islamic population are not people who've got bombs strapped to them.
I don't think anyone does. I think people correctly associate Islam with those things. I certainly do, but then what do I know?
Correct. What do you know? You associate Islam with people with bombs strapped around their waist because you haven't actually thought long and hard about all of the depth of what Islam really is. You are merely reacting to some forms of media sources which you have decided to cherry pick for your own personal benefit.
All I've got to go on is overwhelming evidence. Also, at the risk of...
Wait a second. Overwhelming evidence. Taking into account that it wasn't all that long ago when Richard Coughlin actually put up a video which demonstrated that with a simple Google search you can see that Islamic people are actually against terrorism. So you are talking shit, Mr. Pat Condell.
Sounding like a racist, xenophobic, hate-mongering, Nazi, fascist bigot, it does...
Yes, you are one.
It seems to me that allowing Islamic countries onto a Human Rights Council is like having a bunch of mafiosi on a parole board.
That's a very poor analysis, and you can't say that just because someone follows a certain religion that they are necessarily an evil individual. People are, for the most part, the same everywhere. There are a number of political and socio-economic factors which is making the Middle Eastern countries a little more difficult, but that's not necessarily anything to do with the fact that they are of a certain particular religion. Grow the heck up.
They've already made it perfectly clear that human rights don't apply to them if they conflict with Sharia, which of course they always do.
Well, hang on a second. The word Sharia just means law. Just straightforward, full stop law. And if you think about it, the guy who put up the falsely named Ground Zero Mosque is actually suggesting that everything that's right with America is what's right with Islam, and therefore what's right with Sharia. I think you can see that the logical conclusion of the application of Sharia is in fact the United States of America. So once again, Mr. Pat Condell, you're talking rubbish.
Because civilization conflicts with Sharia.
Come off it. Does America conflict with Sharia? Not properly, no. And Sharia doesn't necessarily mean putting in place religious laws and saying you've got to follow the food laws or the dress laws. It essentially just refers to law. There's movements to try and not only promote Islam as being something which is much more positive and much more human than it is being portrayed by evil right-wing fundamentalist bigots like yourself. You know, people who support UKIP or the BNP, you know, and is trying to say that there is the other dimensions to Islam apart from what the mass media says about the actual faith itself. And there are people in Britain who can choose to convert to Islam. There are people in Britain who are converting away from Islam. Give them their freedom.
In a sane world, these countries wouldn't even be allowed to look in the direction of a Human Rights Council.
In a sane world, everyone should be involved in the Human Rights Council.
Let alone serve on one. We're talking about places like Saudi Arabia, where you can be executed for witchcraft, and where pubescent girls are married off to middle-aged perverts incapable of forming a normal relationship because of their religion.
Yeah, can we have all the statistics about this, please? Because I think you're talking out of your backside like you traditionally do. But I need statistics, not just what is written down somewhere in some rather old book of law. How many people have been executed for witchcraft in Saudi Arabia? How many?
Or Iran, which executes children, and where you can be stoned to death for getting into the wrong relationship. Or Sudan.
Yeah, there are some rather strong laws in some parts of the world, but they are not necessarily going to stay that way. And on top of that, these are states that want to grow and develop, so they're not going to keep these traditions for all that much longer. And on top of that, the varieties of Islamic State are in fact a little more free than you might possibly have thought.
And where slavery is practiced by Muslims over non-Muslims, where the government has murdered millions of its own people, and where the president is an indicted war criminal.
Where the president is an indicted war criminal. Well, there are some people who say that George W. Bush is actually a war criminal, and some people said that about Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. So, I mean, you can carry on making stuff up if you want, but the fact of the matter is that there's other issues going on here.
Talking about places dominated by bloodthirsty clerics who embrace the brutality of Sharia so enthusiastically, you get the impression they enjoy seeing people mutilated and murdered, and their religion is just a convenient excuse.
So now what you're doing is you're equating Sharia with stoning, when essentially the two are completely different.
Scripture-sodden oafs who seem to compete with each other to see who can issue the most fatuous fatwa, degrading and humiliating women as much as possible.
Your polemic is seriously getting under my skin. I mean, at some point I'm probably going to have to stop doing this video just so that I can take a break so my IBS doesn't start flaring up.
Recently, for example, one Saudi scholar declared that women could associate with men they aren't related to by breastfeeding them, which would technically make them their sons. Resourceful all around the twist.
And was this taken seriously, or was this just one nutter talking rubbish?
On a postcard to the King of Saudi Arabia. Another Saudi scholar is on record as saying that women should have to cover themselves so completely that only one eye is visible. What, a whole eye? How shameless. Well, that's the modern world for you. No doubt he would agree with the Iranian scholar who earlier this year made the extraordinary statement that immodestly dressed women are the cause of earthquakes, no less.
No, hang on a minute. That wasn't a scholar, was it? That was just a right-wing fundamentalist lunatic. You can't really call that person a scholar. Now, if that's essentially what your definition of a scholar is, then basically you've got an awful lot of learning to do as to what it means to be scholarly. Alright? There's a difference between a pundit and an actual scholar. Get that into your thick head.
Some of these guys really do have a very serious problem with women, don't they? I mean, this is what...
Yeah, and you've got a very serious problem with 1/3 of the population of planet Earth. Now, piss off.
Way beyond anything you'd call a simple neurosis and deep into hardcore mental illness.
Have you looked at yourself in the mirror recently?
It's a shame that Allah, for all his omnipotence, doesn't seem to know any good psychiatrists.
I don't think it's a question of Allah or whether indeed God does or does not exist. We're talking about people with their views and their values. Values which you plainly do not understand and just wish to rail against because you're a complete fucking twit.
If the Saudis couldn't dig money straight out of the ground, they'd still be living in the Stone Age, as would the entire Arab world, which has produced absolutely nothing of value to humanity for centuries.
There's many more reasons why these states have not done all that well technologically than just their religion. Now, you're not only sounding as bad as Thunderfoot, you're taking something straight from his songbook.
Thanks to a suffocating religion that fosters insularity and ignorance.
I guess that, but you're wrong. There's much more to it than that, and the fact that they've got a religion doesn't necessarily mean to say that they are wrong or they are necessarily deluded or delusional.
to mention a chronic and crippling sexual repression that makes Catholicism look like San Francisco in the 1960s.
Oh yeah, and how often do you get it, for crying out loud? It looks like you haven't even come for years.
And the damage this does can be seen in many places in the Islamic world, not least in the country of Pakistan, which is not strictly speaking an Islamic dictatorship, but it might as well be. It's a democracy, a fragile and corrupt democracy with nuclear weapons.
Like ours, basically.
Great. It's also a very Islamic country. How Islamic? Blasphemy carries the death penalty, and it doesn't get any more Islamic than that.
No, it doesn't get any more extreme and fundamentalist than that. The fact that they carry the death penalty for blasphemy does not necessarily mean to say that that is an Islamic thing. There's a difference.
Indeed, right at this moment, a woman is awaiting death by hanging because she happens to get into an argument with some Muslims who promptly accused her of blasphemy. That's how Islamic Pakistan is.
No, that's how extreme and fundamentalist and lunatic Pakistan is. That's not how Islamic Pakistan is. There is a difference. You're twisting the semantics now.
In fact, it's such an Islamic country that 80% of Pakistani women are regularly beaten by their husbands, and in the area around the city of Karachi, a woman is murdered every day.
Alright, and how many murders do we have in the UK? How many murders do we have in the USA? Compare and contrast the figures. How many murders are there in the whole of Europe? Well, you've got to compare like land masses and like populations with like. You can't just come out with this, ooh, aren't they scary, aren't they evil kind of bollocks. Because like, it's wrong. And it is wrong because it's not scientifically accurate, and it's just a polemic.
However, the Pakistani government is less concerned about these cowardly atrocities than it is about religious offence, taking care to block websites critical of Islam because they don't want anyone's morals corrupted.
Is that necessarily the reason, or is it much more a question of lack of, civil unrest?
Meanwhile, Pakistan distinguishes itself on the internet by leading the world in Google searches for animal sex, child sex, and rape sex.
I thought that was Germany.
Normal, consensual sex between human adults is apparently something of a minority taste in that devout country, according to Google.
Maybe you're talking about Texas.
Now, given all this, you might be surprised to hear that both Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have recently been appointed to the board of the new United Nations Agency for Women. Yes, that's right, I said women. Both of these countries will be doing all they can to work for the empowerment and the equality of women all over the world, isn't it?
That should be regarded as being a good thing and a positive step which says something good about Islamic people.
That great news, and how wonderfully inclusive of the United Nations to hand the fox the keys to the hen house yet again. Yes.
No, I think it's a little more complex than that, and there are people in other countries and other political denominations who may have some disagreements if some kind of extremist interpretation was placed upon what women should be allowed to do. I think you should grow the fuck up yet again, please, Mr. Pat Condell.
Okay, these countries may well treat women like dogs, but hey, that's their culture, right? And we've got to respect it, don't we? I mean,
that's not what it means to have a culture. Right? Culture is a little more complex than just their attitudes towards religion or women or dogs.
Who are we to judge, after all? I mean, it's all just relative anyway, isn't it? I mean...
Oh, shut up, you piece of rubbish.
Just because a thing is insane and barbaric and downright evil, does that necessarily make it wrong?
Yes, you are insane, you are barbaric, you are downright evil, and yes, you are wrong. In every possible way. Go away.
I mean, who are we to judge? Surely we're not arrogant enough.
Yeah, Pat Condell, who are you to judge? You are nothing. You're a washed-up has-been who supports UKIP, for Christ's sakes. You are not only a minority, you're a pain in the arse.
To assume that our values are superior just because they're more civilized, or that their values are somehow less valid. No, no. In the spirit of mutual understanding.
I'm just concerned that people are going to listen to this and think, like, I want to become just like him. I really do think so, you know, because he's got that like groovy, plain white background, you know, he's got reasonable lighting, and it looks relatively normal and slightly amateurish, but not too amateurish.
And tolerance and respect and harmony and bridge building and all the other bullshit buzzwords of the new PC totalitarianism, we simply have to accept that brutalizing half of humanity for the sake of pathetically inadequate male egos and primitive superstition is just part of the rich tapestry, the rich diversity of...
You have a go at primitive superstition, but yet you are someone who's exhibiting very old world views and values which are outmoded, and it would still be a great thing if you were to just piss off.
Cultures and faiths that so enrich us all. Isn't that right? Well, isn't it? You know those bedbugs at the United Nations? I shouldn't worry too much about them. I think they'll leave of their own accord when they realize the company they're keeping.
I've said enough.